We are looking at Amiens Cathedral in northern France. It was built in the 13th century and is regarded as a model of the Gothic style. Late in the 12th century, a leading churchman remarked that Europe was clothed in new churches. It was a period of immense economic growth, and almost all the major cities in the continent, as well as the major abbeys, were building new churches in this new style. The style itself came into being in the 1150s in one place, at Saint-Denis, which was a monastery just to the north of Paris where the French kings had been buried for centuries, and was a very wealthy institution. And in replacing its older church with a new one, its abbot, Abbot Cihtog, sought to build something entirely new. What was he after? Well, if you had looked at the churches that had been built in the latter part of the 11th and the earlier 12th century, you would see that they were very thick-walled churches based on what is called the barrel vault. If you looked at the vault of the interior of the church, you would see this great round set of arches going down the nave and across the transept, because these churches were all built in the form of the cross. And that kind of arch, the round arch, thrusts enormous forces out, and as a result, the walls that hold it have to be very thick, and you can't cut many windows in them. So these churches tended to be quite dark, even when they were very tall. Some of them reached 150 feet tall, but they were quite dark. And in order to alleviate the darkness, the inner walls were painted in murals depicting scenes from both the Old and the New Testament. And in many of them, sculptors, the stonemasons who built these cathedrals, were also sculptors, would carve animals and plants and gargoyles, these fantastic creatures, around the capitals, anywhere where they could find exposed stone that was not needed for structural purpose. And this decorated the interior of the church. What Cihtog wanted was light. He was a student of the new Platonic philosophy, which was influencing European thought at the time, and in that philosophy, light was critical. Light was from God. It was an emanation of God, and getting light into the church was really critical, because the church was a sanctuary that represented the cosmos, and the cosmos was infused with light, so the representation of the cosmos also had to be infused with light. So Cihtog, with an architect whose name we do not know, worked toward changing the way the building was built so that the walls could be made thinner and could be opened up to windows. And the secret to this was the pointed arch. In the pointed arch, the forces are thrust more downward than outward, and therefore the walls can be reduced in thickness, and you can weaken them by opening up windows. And you have then the development of a plan, which is, like some of the older churches, cruciform. Its altar is on the east end of the church, so the church is oriented east-west. The west end is always the front door, the west front, as it is usually called, and has a porch, and the bell towers are there. The east end has an apse, which is a rounded form, like a niche, into which the altar is set. And because the architects of these churches began to make the walls so thin and so perforated by windows that they were even inadequate for the pointed arches and vaults that resulted from lining up the pointed arches in the nave and in the transept, they had to build buttresses on the exterior. And in order to let light through those buttresses, they made them what is called flying buttresses. You can see them here to a certain extent, but we'll see them close up as we move through the slides. So you have then a church which is based upon what would in that day been a modern theory about the structure of the universe, based on the perfect geometry and on the infusion of light. So let's move on now to another view of Amiens Cathedral, and then go into the cathedral and take a look. Here we're looking at the cathedral from ground level. You can see that it is higher than most of the other buildings around it, not merely because of its own height, but also because typically these buildings were built on the highest point of the city, and then the houses and the streets radiate out from this central point. Here you can see the flying buttresses. You can see the way they're built. They're towers that are built out from the wall of the church, and then arches which are flown into the wall of the church to hold the wall stable. They were lined up, as you can see, along the nave, and you see them also around the apse, and they help to contain the wall, which is under pressure from the pointed arches that make up the vault. You can also see one of the towers in the west front. There is another one on the other side. These were the bell towers of the church, and there were times when those bells would ring all day long because of some event, the election of a pope, the victory of the king, or whatever that called for celebration. They would ring all day long, and their vibrations were pretty serious, so that some churches were actually damaged by their own bells. And in most of these churches today, you can't ring the bells because the buildings are old enough so that the vibrations are to be avoided. These churches typically also had a spire which was over the transept, where the transept and the nave crossed one another, as you can see here. Here is a close-up of a flying buttress, and you can actually see that it is a double tower. The inner tower has a large arch which has columns in it, so that it itself is not solid, but it braces the wall. And then the tower itself is braced by another smaller tower which has a short arch that reaches it. And so you have the whole thing held in by these structures which march down the side of the building. Here we are looking down the nave toward the altar and the apse. You can see that it's rounded. This cathedral has lost most of its stained glass windows to bombing during the world wars of the 20th century. But most of those windows would have been stained glass and shown scenes from the Bible. They replaced the paintings on the walls of the Romanesque churches that preceded the Gothic style. In the medieval period, there would be no pews, no furniture on the pavement of the church, and so your eye would sweep from entering the church right up through and into the vault. The entire structure is geometrically designed. That is to say, the architects, under the influence of the intellectuals who ran these churches, designed the churches in proportions. So the basic form of a church like this was likely to be a square. That is, a 1-to-1 ratio of the width of the church to its height. And the various portions of the church would then be in proportions of 2-to-1 and 3-to-2. 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-2 were regarded since ancient times as golden proportions, the natural proportions of the whole universe. And since this building represented the universe, its proportions should represent the universe as well. And this was, by the way, connected with music, since the intervals of notes and the structure of the musical scale was also recognized to have mathematical exactitude, and a good deal of the study of music was actually the study of mathematical theory. And it was thought that the structure of the universe created the music of the spheres, that the reverberations of God's light coming through the structure of the universe created a music which was based upon its proportions and its intervals. And this church was built in order to recreate that kind of structure, that ordered, mathematically exact structure. Here we are looking at what is called the ambulatory. There was an aisle that ran around the church and all the way around behind the altar into the apse. From this aisle, there would radiate out into the sides of the church various chapels that were often endowed by leading families in the town, and people would come and use, and still do use, of course. One nice thing about this picture is that one of the last remaining stained glass windows can be seen here, and you can see the way the light would flood into this aisle and through it to the nave. And you can also see, looking up into the nave, which is next to this part of the church, that there were windows all along the top of the walls These are called clear-story windows, and they provided additional light. So this is a church which is flooded with light, and it would have been a light of multicolor because of the stained glass windows. This is another view of the pavement, and here you can see the piers. The church's vault rests on these piers which march down the nave, and also smaller piers march down the aisles, and you can see the smaller ones off to the right. These were great stone piers that were built on patterns. They etched a pattern of the pier in the floor of the basement of the church, and the stonemasons working down there would carve the stones to the pattern, and you can see that they're made of courses. So there's a carved stone and then another one put on top of one another, and the exact measure of that course of stones was made by fitting it to the etched pattern on the basement floor and then lifted up into place. This is made with mortar, so there is something that holds these stones together, but the weight, of course, of the building and the way in which the stresses are distributed would help to keep the whole thing together as well. The idea of proportions that represented the proportions of the universe, the mathematical structure of the universe, was carried over into sculpture. You will always see a standing figure, and in this case we have 3 figures of Christ from different Gothic cathedrals around France. The statues of Christ, the statues of the saints, were almost always made in this form, standing with an arm that was raised at the elbow, and the elbow was the break point in this design, so that the statue was from head to elbow 1/3, and from elbow to feet 2/3. The 2-to-1 ratio, which was one of the golden ratios that determined the structure of the universe, and you would see this throughout the Gothic tradition. I spoke of vaults, and here is the vault at Amiens. We're looking up in the nave near the rounded end. You can see that there are some stained glass windows up there in the clear story that are still left, but most of them are clear. In a Romanesque church, you would have been looking up into a round, heavy vault, and here you can see you're looking up into something which is articulated. The ribs of the vault, which hold up the roof or the ceiling, run from arch to arch, and the basic arches are pointed. Later in the development of this style in the 14th century and even the 15th century, you'd find that the arches were even more severely pointed, narrower in their aspect, and that the vaults would be elaborated into dozens and dozens of complex ribs, and that style is called flamboyant. You would find that in Westminster Cathedral and in King's College Chapel in Cambridge, and that was basically the end of the Gothic. It led to a more and more elaborate articulation of the rib structure of these vaults. But here you see it in its original form, simple, very effective ceiling structure that sits on the piers coming up from the floor. Here's a close-up of one of the vaults, this one in an aisle, therefore much lower than the nave, but you can see how the rib operates in relation to the basic arches that are sitting on the piers and structuring this whole building. This is the rose window at the west end of the church. Almost every single cathedral had a rose window at the west end above the great portals through which you entered the church. The rose window was highly symbolic. Here you can see it was always stained and very elaborately decorated. You can see its complex tracery which supports the glass. Those are called mullions, and they are to be found in all of the windows in the Gothic cathedrals, made of stone, but the glass is held in an iron framework, which you can see here in concentric circles. The symbolism of the circle was universal, the same as in China and in Islam. The circle was a symbol of infinity. It had no beginning and end. God was sometimes described in the Western tradition as a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. And the circle was also symbolic of fortune, the wheel of fortune, which turned inexorably. And on the outside of these cathedrals, you would find in many cases a relief sculpture next to the window of Lady Fortune turning her wheel, and at the top of it might be sitting a king in crown and scepter. But on the side that was turning down, that royal figure would be falling, and the crown would be coming off, and he would be losing control of his scepter. And at the bottom, he'd be prostrate, and then coming up around, he would be reinvesting. In other words, his clothing would be coming back onto him because he was on the ascendant. And the medieval people thought that that was the way of the world. Everybody rose and went down, that Lady Fortune turned her wheel, and you were stuck. You were on top sometimes, and you were on bottom at other times. You were losing your vestments, the clothing that symbolized your status and your wealth and your position in the world at some times, and you were reinvesting at other times. And the rose window became the site for the presentation of that fundamental truth about the world. Now go look at the website on Amiens Cathedral at Columbia University. This is the URL. You'll be able to see the way the cathedral developed. You'll see close-ups of windows and sculpture. You'll be able to walk into the cathedral and look around it, and it'll give you a really good view of what we have seen in static pictures.